Cool. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to ACMI. This afternoon we've got Kelani, Xanthe, and Kelli here to fascinate us. I'm going to start with an acknowledgement of country. So at ACMI we acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, on whose land we meet. And we pay our respect to elders past and present and extend our respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of all nations of this land. So I'm going to introduce very briefly Kelani, who's come from New York City to be here. We had the pleasure of Kelani being involved in our Preserving the Near Future symposium that ran yesterday. And she's, among other things, a really dynamic contemporary curator. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on where art is at in 2018.
Thank you. So we're just going to start by sharing a little bit of our work. Each of us are going to go through some examples so you have an idea of what our practice consists of. So I'm going to kick it off. I run an experimental exhibition space called Transfer. It was founded in 2013 in the Bushwick neighborhood of Brooklyn. And in that time, it's become an internationally known gallery supporting variable media art, computer-based art, software-based practice. At Transfer, the generation of artists I support requires a kind of iterative and experimental way of working. The studios function more in line with the ideas of technology culture than the rigid institutions and scarcity models of the art world. And this is a huge part of what's always motivated my work at Transfer. I feel the underlying tension around scarcity in the art world is shifting. Artworks such as animated GIFs are meant to live online. And this kind of distributed artwork is an important movement in contemporary art. It has the potential to reshape cultural audiences and become a disruptive market force. So this is a look at my gallery in Brooklyn. With each show, it transforms completely. I like to think of it as an open space for experimentation. Oftentimes the shows are more in a black box sort of presentation rather than a white cube. Here you see some work that I've been doing with VR Commission. I noticed that many of my artists were producing these very thoughtful works within VR, but there wasn't much opportunity to exhibit them. So I started a commissioning program based on the idea of how does a work extend beyond the headset back into the shared space of the gallery, and what kinds of experimentation is needed to support artists in getting this work seen and sparking real critical dialogue around the work. Here you see work from Dutch artist Rosam Eggman, Behind White Shadows, and we took care in the exhibition to create this really immersive environment in which you wouldn't even know it was VR work. Actually, the virtual reality is kind of tucked away behind this figure in the gallery. Here's another example of the commission from Claudia Hart. This is the flower matrix. When you enter into this chamber, it's actually a mixed reality chamber. So all of the surfaces here are augmented reality, which is a nice social way for people to experience virtualized things. You can kind of hold up an iPad, everyone can point and share that experience together. It eases you into what you're about to experience within the fully embodied piece. I also have this format that I call the Transfer Download. This is the most recent exhibition of this format. It was installed at the Toma Foundation. Actually, it still is in Santa Fe, New Mexico, in the US. It's up there for a year. And the idea of this format is that it creates one kind of immersive environment, but it represents a variety of media formats. So there's animated GIFs, there's virtual reality, there's algorithmic works, there's new kinds of experimental moving images. So in other words, it's a quote-unquote download of all of the ways that artists are working with these new practices. It was first developed 2 summers ago at the Minnesota Street Project in San Francisco, which is a very experimental kind of gallery community. And the idea was that I wanted to create a new format for a group show in a virtualized space where I could show a lot of different media in one physical location. And it's sort of just very simple in context, and it is really adaptable to different contexts. Here you see it at the NADA Art Fair. So I've taken it into the market context, and I've found it a really effective way to sort of tell the story of variable media, let media shine as media and not make it object-based, but still make it impactful for different audiences. This is my new role. Now in 2018, I'm doing something a little bit different. I'm handing over my programming at the gallery so that I can have more space to work with The Current, which is a new kind of museum. Our goal is to support the things that other museums can't or maybe aren't interested in supporting. So we're collecting a lot of web-based works, things that are available in the open public web. And more importantly, we're building a community of patrons, of young patrons who are helping us build this collection. So we have these salon happenings. We do about 4 a year. Here you see the very first one. We started in 2018, so we've only done a couple. But the topic was around identity. We focus on a topic. We invite a curator to select works. We install them in this home-like environment. People are able to gather around the work, spend time with the work. There we go. You get a sense of what the experience is like. Very intimate. Here you see one of our committee members reclining in a hammock, looking at a Jacoby Satterwhite piece. It's a very special loan that we had for that. This is the founder of the museum, William Nathan. He's a young startup entrepreneur himself, so he also comes from this world of technology. That's my background as well. And we're bringing a new kind of thinking into how a museum can support this generation of practice. So when we invite our members in, it's a very low price point. For $250 each salon, you can become a part of our collections committee, which is very much an inversion. I don't know how much you all know about the way museums work, but typically it's only a very high net worth individual that has a say in what becomes part of our cultural heritage. And we're kind of trying to turn that on its head and open that up to new perspectives so that the collection is actually more representative of the contemporary moment. So this clicker is a little tricky here. Just a few more images of that. So we've collected now 10 artworks, and I'm very happy to say that only 3 of them are by men. So we're creating a new kind of collection, and the big thing that's different about The Current is we're thinking beyond brick and mortar, so we don't have a brick and mortar location. We're purely salon happening based. So instead of guests coming to the museum, the idea is that the collection goes with you. So our members are invited to display the works in their home and dwell with the works, and that also builds a new kind of relationship with this type of work. I think that's my last slide. So I'm going to hand it over to Xanthe now to walk through some of her work. Yeah.
Yeah, well, these two are going to talk much more about the broader context of digital practices, I feel. I'm just going to talk about myself, because that's what I know about. I can't tell you how to make money, because I certainly don't have any, but I can tell you about practice and what I've been doing. So I'm just sort of loosely going to go through a few of the series that I've been working on in the last few years and sort of why I've been doing them. What you see before you currently is... Okay. Bring it down. Yeah, we'll keep it moving. So this is from one of my recent series called 21st Century Greatest Hits Screensaver Pack. They are an ongoing collection of works, which I am theoretically still making, but I like to sort of be working on multiple things simultaneously, which you will come to understand as we go through these sporadic slides that represent my practice. This one is called 2004 Tiger Lily. So each one of this series was based on a Pantone color of the year. So I started thinking about, I don't know why that's not playing. Oh, there we go. I started thinking about the Pantone colors of the year. I think I read some sort of BuzzFeed article or something. I spend a lot of time on the internet. And I was thinking about these colors and the way that they have these broader socio-political ramifications. Whoa, that's from somewhere else. That's a different work. We'll get to that. So this one is called, this is 2006, I believe, blue turquoise. So each of them was supposed to be sort of a highly personalized look at sort of a biased history of being a person that has grown up with the internet. So the Pantone colors of the year started in the year 2000, and then each year they've brought out a different one. So I started with 2000 and am ideally working towards now, but I've hit a bit of a wall with it and have stopped at 2007 for right now, which was a great year. That was the slide that was up when you all came in. It was the year that J.K. Rowling proclaimed that Dumbledore was gay, which was just a hugely defining moment in my life, it turns out. So those are still sort of being made, but the idea behind them is that they are actually downloadable screensavers. So I suppose I'm sort of moving towards an area where we theoretically step away from the white cube, which I believe we're going to talk about quite substantially later on, and sort of introduce the artwork into a home environment, especially engaging with this idea of the screensaver as being this sort of totally redundant, ridiculous space, which is kind of a nice parallel for how I think a lot of the mainstream thinks about art galleries in general. Yeah, a lot of my work is highly cynical. This is 2006, Sand Dollar. That was the year that Steve Irwin passed away, our national hero. Also the year that Time magazine brought out that sort of blank cover for Person of the Year that just had a screen with you written on it. There was also that cyclone in Queensland. There was that huge banana crisis, which really shook people to their very core. Yeah. Also, Google bought out YouTube, so lots of stuff happening that year. This is some of the stuff that I've been working on lately. That is a GIF. I'm hoping that it will move if I press this thing. Yes. So recently I have returned to Instagram after a 4-year sabbatical. I think that I got really caught up in the idea, being sort of an artist that has worked with internet and notions of post-internet, that if I was going to be on Instagram, it would have to be like some sort of meaningful interaction with the medium. So I decided to start making these sort of daily collages when I went on break I'm currently doing my master's in film up in Sydney. And as soon as the semester was done, I was like, oh no, I feel purposeless. I'm going to need to start making shit immediately. So I started making these sort of instantaneous series based on just whatever I was into at the time, and kind of looking at immediate fan response and internet culture. So my first week was based all in RuPaul's Drag Race fandom. This is Santino Rice, and it's based on the cover or the movie poster for The Holy Mountain. This is Shea Coulee. She came to slay, not to play. So the first week that I was doing this, I was working sort of in Photoshop and in Premiere, and then I wound up coming to Melbourne. I didn't have any programs, so I started working with Instagram as the actual medium of creation. If you go into the Stories app on Instagram, there's like this really great Giphy plugin that has all got like pre-rotoscoped out GIFs, and you can just make like crazy shit. So they were all on my phone, so I couldn't put them in this slideshow. They're also incredibly low res, so I went with these debut ones, but I would encourage you to go and have a look. ACMI has reposted a couple of them this week. I'm trying to bring them out as often as possible, but as I said, I get distracted quite easily. This is from a couple of years ago. These are going to remain still because the works were just too big to put in here. This is part of a series that I made a few years ago for Next Wave Festival in 2016. It was a collaborative piece with this artist from Sydney. These are my sides of the work. It was called 1 Million Views, and essentially we followed around 6 Australian YouTube celebrities. Bit of a stretch of a term, really. They just had to have more than 1 million views to qualify within our rubric. And we followed them around and sort of looked at their on and offline existences, and then I built this collection of sort of shrines to their online personalities. And Tian Baker, the other artist involved, she was looking at sort of their more intimate inside lives and the way that they actually functioned as individuals. And I think that when we started this process, we thought that we were going to come to something really profound about identity being this sort of binary on and offline thing, but then as we went further and further into it, which we will also talk about, I think that we've come to realize that the online and the offline are so intertwined at this point that these people's identities couldn't really be split into these two tightly packaged things. And it turned out that sort of their online was a place where they were much more comfortable, and these representations that I made of them were kind of more about how they actually felt, and then going into their personal spaces seemed kind of wrong and voyeuristic. Yeah, it was an interesting series. I think that is possibly the end of my slides, but I do have a 360 work that's sort of a sketch of an idea for places that I'm interested in going beyond this point. I've been up at film school, so I've been sort of experimenting with narrative form in a way that I haven't before. I've been doing a lot of sort of poetic essay writing. Anyway, this is a piece called Godwin's Law, which is sort of the start of an idea. You might want to put the sound up on
Do
this
you
one.
wonder what it would be like to be inside the internet? Life in the cloud. WTF even is a cloud? What would that look like? Is it ominous towers of information? Cords and little lights blipping and shit, like Hackers or The Matrix or some other 90s cyberpunk classic. Just heaps of hot girls with Yves Klein blue lips and short leather skirts. Everybody on those wheelie sneakers or razor scooters, those are coming back. How was bubblegum pop ever even a thing? Or is it like a huge expanse of space? Infinite. Packed with our garbage, our thoughts, our contemporary histories. With us fucking each other and ourselves. It seems impossible to imagine all of our collective global information, out there, milling about and bashing itself together. It is violent, but it is dancing. Is it a crowded freeway? But with a road in every direction and all the cars have subreddits and subtweets and subcultures. This is subcultism. This is where we feel safe. In our bubbles, wrapped in algorithmic blankets of targeted advertising. Never let me out, please. Is it the universe? Our man-made galaxy of bullshit and genius. But what is what? I am God now, but so are you. I have everything I need here, but please remember to subscribe and like this post.
Yeah, that's where I'm at. So, let's move along.
You wonder
Here's some
what it
real
would be
shit.
like to be in.
Hi, well, I'm Kelli Alred. So I'm going to attempt, I don't know if there's really anyone here or many people here who were here yesterday, but I think my thinking in coming in was to sort of bridge something between the two conversations. So a few caveats. I probably won't be talking about anything that's very emerging, and I probably won't use the word digital, but I will use the word new media quite a bit and a few other words that will become apparent. The other thing is, if the text really doesn't interest you, then there's a different text on the slide. So just to confuse you or offer you two different ways to enter into the presentation, those are available to you. But I'm hoping that the logic will come through of the conversation. I was asked to really talk about a set of work that I did a number of years ago that I finished doing about 6 years ago, and then I had started 8 years before that. So I was compelled to throw in some things about what I'm doing now at the end of the presentation, and I'm hoping that the logic will feed through the text so that you can see how these things connect for me, and I'll be interested to see how that unfolds in the discussion. So yes, no word digital there. But these are the things that I'm into, which are often involved in digital art. That's just going to zoom along in the background. So I'm currently the Artistic Director of Channels Festival, which is an international video art festival based here in Melbourne, and I'm in the final year of a PhD investigating the notion of curating time. I've worked as a curator, program manager, producer, independent performance artist and consultant within the visual arts, live art, dance, sound art and new media sectors in Australia, the UK and Europe. I joined, this material that you're looking at is linked to a program that I ran at the Tate. I joined the Tate originally as the webcasting and net art curator in 2003, consolidating and expanding those programs into the more broadly defined area of intermedia art, which I oversaw from 2006 to 2012. In this context, I worked across the exhibitions, collections, conservations, public programs, media and research departments to commission and present moving image, new media, performance, participatory art, activist art, sound art and electronic music. I work closely with Pip Lawrenson, who is the head of conservation research at Tate, on a project called Matters in Media Art in collaboration with institutions such as MoMA, SF MoMA, Stanford University Library, New York University and the Getty, to look collectively at the challenges and opportunities that new media, time-based and performative art practice presents to the museum sector in terms of exhibitioning, accessioning, documenting, describing, categorising, acquiring and conserving. As part of this research, I developed a model for describing and documenting networked art. The aim was to clarify a process through which the museum was able to establish what elements are essential to capture and maintain in order to conserve and redisplay the work. The model acknowledged that the artwork may involve a range of internal and external dependencies, or otherwise have an inherent relationship to change. These changes may be innate to the form, the concept, or actual intent of the artwork, or they may relate to unavoidable changes occurring throughout ongoing cycles of storage, maintenance, and display. The model proposes that the identity of the artwork, in many cases, is larger than the artwork itself. This is due to the fact that many of these artworks are heavily context-dependent and/or process-orientated, such that if the artwork's connection to its context or its process is not maintained, the artwork's identity and therefore its integrity or authenticity may be damaged. I also led a 2-year research network on the display and acquisition of time-based art, collaborating with colleagues again from Tate, MoMA and SF MoMA, but also London Science Museum, Laboral Centre for Creative Industries based in Asturias in the north of Spain, the British Library and Queen Mary University. This network of colleagues examined new media art as well as time-based art and performative practices more broadly. This is the model for documenting networked art that you're looking at here. So in relation to core themes of authenticity and performativity, addressing the practical, methodological and the philosophical challenges that new media art presents in a museum context. The participants of the network included artists as well as scholars in various fields, including art history, design, cultural theory and law, as well as curators, conservators, archivists, librarians, computer scientists, art handlers and government policy representatives. The first task of the network was to define the scope of the research via a discourse on the formal qualities and defining characteristics of new media art as it was to be discussed within the group. We agreed that new media art is a generic term used to describe art related to or created with a technology invented or made widely available since the mid-20th century. Because technology moves rapidly and the term is used to encompass a very broad spectrum of practices that sometimes overlap with non-art sectors such as science and design, a definitive definition of new media art was difficult to pin down. Beryl Graham, one of the network members, suggested that new media art tended to demonstrate innate behavioural attributes, which distinguished it significantly from other art forms, referring to the work of researcher Caitlin Jones and quoting curator Steve Dietz, characteristics of connectivity, computation and interaction. Graham also suggested that new media artworks tend to be open-ended and interactive, demonstrating an innate relationship to ongoing transformation. Matthew Fuller emphasised the kinds of materiality, processes and symbolic registers emblematic of new media, proposing that particular social, political and aesthetic drivers will tend to articulate these in different ways, either explicitly or implicitly, concluding that the most interesting new media art will not simply use these mechanisms as a means to send and store content, but bring these processes of articulation to the fore in the composition of the work. Jamie Stapleton suggested that the more one tried to define new media art, the more diffuse it became, suggesting that pragmatically there is an entity called new media or digital art, but it was a moving target as technology changes over time. He argued that making a rigid and consistent definition was not that helpful and that it was strange to seek definitions for new media or digital art when we had given up the project of setting boundary definitions for painting and sculpture in the 60s and 70s. While the most obvious vulnerability of new media art is rapid technological obsolescence, the study of its other aspects, including hybrid, contextual or live qualities, is equally important. Museums must acknowledge that the ephemeral and temporal attributes of new media art and other performative forms will often involve complex layers of audience participation and encounter. The management of time, including the need for downtime, setup time, technical testing, etc., can have a significant impact on how spaces within the museum are used and allocated, as well as the scheduling of exhibitions and events within the program. In this context, new media art and other participatory forms fundamentally challenge the museum's understanding of its audience and the basic question of how the viewer or user is constituted in that context. How a museum interfaces these works and on what terms the public can access, reproduce and or build on the work, the form of the work, what is acquired, what authenticity means, how the work is allowed to be displayed and interacted with, what potential there is for future configurations, all depends on titles, contracts and copyright. How artworks are handled, cared for and displayed is contingent upon the rights a museum buys, leases and maintains. Displaying more traditional forms of art is often a case of managing risk and decay. However, media-based and performative forms tend to thrive on executing their live attributes. The more a work is displayed, the more knowledge is acquired. New media works have the best chance of survival if we invest in reproducing, reperforming and remediating them at regular intervals. Of course, no matter how social, performative or experience-based new media art might be, it would nonetheless be problematic to ignore the art's material components and the hardware that makes it accessible. Many of the issues surrounding the presentation and preservation of new media art are related to its materiality, although bits and bytes, you might be surprised to realise, are ultimately more stable than paint or analogue video, certainly more stable than fat, felt and parrots, which are all materials used in artworks currently on display at Tate Modern. The challenge comes in understanding how we should define and value a work of digital art when it is heavily dependent on its context, its audience, or complex computational processes, when it has an ongoing relationship to change, evolution, or loss, and where its unlimited distribution makes it technically impossible to confirm how many editions exist. Yesterday, in the session around the conservation of digital art, we discussed some of the challenges around the conservation of new media art. However, from a curatorial perspective, it's apparent that museums must also be able to articulate the art historical narratives that inform or contextualize this type of work, drawing a map across Dada, Fluxus, conceptual art and performance, feminist and new wave practices, net art, new and old media, because ultimately, resolving the more pragmatic concerns of how we install, manage or maintain new media art is less challenging than bringing this work into the canon of art history. The time-based and dynamic nature of new media art is not medium-specific, but applies equally to many video and performance art practices. And it is also the case that artists have used pretty much any media they can get their hands on, including books, magazines, posters, fax machines, mail, magnetic tape, radio, television, telephones, and the internet as a means to distribute, display, or perform their work for decades. From Dada onward, artists have employed a range of publishing, distribution, intervention, and event strategies, subverted traditional notions of the authentic, autonomous art object, bypassed institutional representation and challenged the commodification of their work.
Thank you so much. So this is kind of a special opportunity for me because I feel like I've come all the way to a new part of the world. And Kelli, I didn't know your practice specifically before we spoke online a few weeks ago, but it's clear that so much of your work has influenced me and created a space for what I'm doing within the contemporary art world. And Xanthe, it feels like you're just part of my program, or should be. So it's like I feel like we're like in a very shared space here. So I'm really excited to facilitate this discussion. And we're going to jump right into this word digital. I heard you use it twice, Kelli.
Well, that was only to, trying to make it relevant. It wasn't in the text. I just threw it in.
Okay. So, digital is in the title here. And digital is a word that I tend to take issue with as well. When we talk about digital art, the work is immediately separated into a differentiated field. But those of us who have an intimate understanding of the work in this field, and as Kelli has just showed us in depth, it's a false binary. In fact, the digital is so integrated into our contemporary moment. Every aspect of culture, consumption, relationships, and production are mediated by technology. So when you stop and think about that as a term, it approximates absurdity to continue to perpetuate this divide, but we still use it. So I think a lot about this when I'm speaking about the work that I support, and I try to use language that is rich with other information, maybe about the conceptual or formal qualities of the work, instead of this broad categorization. That's my approach, to bring contemporary practice more into full view. But I want to talk a little bit more explicitly about this binary, and maybe if each of you can share a little bit about the ways in which your work is refiguring this kind of binary.
Sure. I'll start that.
Okay.
Why not?
Yeah.
Big question. Look, for me, the binary structures are not useful in any context, really. I think that within my practice, yes, I do work a lot with sort of the on and offline and the way that they intermingle with each other, because I believe them to be totally inseparable parts of experience. So I'm interested in breaking down not only the binary between those two things, but between physical and non-physical, as well as gender binaries and binaries of sexuality, and binaries between animal and human and machine. I've gotten really into the Cyborg Manifesto lately, so I suppose that is like a hugely influential part of the way that I've been thinking about practice lately. I've been especially thinking about the way that through process, so sure, my work at the end of the day is talking about that interaction in a final state of being on and offline or in some sort of fusion state, but also within the actual process of creation, the way that we as organic beings interact with our machines to create something new. I'm looking at sort of technological romance between me and my softwares. Yeah. Yeah, hopefully I'll write something of note about it at some point. It's going to be awesome, guys. Keep an eye out.
Okay, well, because you had that little note there about Karen Barad, I know that you were hoping I would get into this kind of a bit of a theoretical framework. So I made some notes just before the session, once I saw that little hint. Thank you. So, I mean, on the kind of interoperability of different forms, I'm really interested in the work that Karen Barad has been doing around post-human performativity at the moment, but I'm going to just wind back a little bit and give you a little bit of narrative about how this kind of is situated in my own thinking about video art, new media art in general, so, and with a bit of a feminist bent. So starting with kind of Amelia Jones and, her discussion in the kind of late 80s, early 90s around sort of televisual texture and the embodiment of our technological selves and the transcendence of self in a kind of post-capitalist technologized culture. She talked about, and she's talking about really early video art from the 70s when she's theorizing about this, and she talks about the screen as surface, the screen as flesh or as orifice. And it's really looking at those kind of direct address early video arts, that are very emblematic of that early video art period. I mean, these days that kind of screen texture is enhanced by interactivity and the breakdown of audience and artist relationships, the internet, all of that sort of stuff. So these notions of the cyborg and the writing that Anne and Catherine Hales did around notions of the post-human is really interesting, which is now bleeding into the kind of new material. So what interests me about what Karen is saying is that she's looking at non-binaries as being discursive, that they're kind of interpenetrating time, space, and form. So both bodies and other matter, as well as time and space, are kind of oscillating in a relation with one another, that all elements have agency and there is no passivity, and that we are constantly transforming both within ourselves and impacting and transforming one another. So I think that's really, assists me to think about breaking down binaries.
Yeah, it makes you feel important in an existential time.
Right. So, I mean, I think that this word digital is useful still in some ways. Is it? I guess that's my question to you.
Well, as useful as any form of language can be, really.
I think we're kind of on a cusp, maybe, I just feel like really someday very soon we'll be differentiating about what is analog. Because, almost everything has a digital copy if it wasn't born digital. Yeah. And so at what point does that coin flip? And we start to go, like we do analog video now. You don't really say digital video anymore. You say video and you differentiate the analog video. Yeah.
I think that's the perfect way to jump into our next topic, which is around simulation and virtual reality and virtual space. So simulation and interactivity are core components of all of our practices. We're using immersive technology to create aesthetic experiences that are performative, responsive, and behavioral. And it requires a deeper level of understanding of our audience, of how embodied bodies form and space and time function in the work. So I'd like to talk about the ways in which each of you are engaging with immersive technologies like CGI, virtual and augmented reality, and interactivity in your work. So Xanthe, we talked specifically about your experience making this new VR work, and you were talking about this practice of sort of like spatially editing and what that kind of immersive space becomes in the creation of the work.
I think that, VR, I think, is still very much in its fledgling state. I don't think that anybody's fully figured out how to make that a totally impactful medium at this point. And we're trying to cram it into so many different areas. In narrative cinema, they're really giving it a red hot go, and it's just disastrous. but I think that within the context of art, it makes a lot of sense. And I think that going through art school, especially within the last 10 years, where everything has moved very much into interdisciplinary and new media practices, we're constantly being taught and sort of exploring our own practices spatially. So I think that VR is a really beautiful and low-cost way to consider artwork spatially as well as within time, which I know you will say this in a much more academically articulate way momentarily, I'm sure, but here I am nonetheless. For me, I found the process of editing spatially to be a super interesting one, and one that actually makes a lot more sense for me in my mind working with these softwares and trying to think about how you as an individual are going to be experiencing this work. Because when you experience installation work within a gallery context, you are always thinking about the sort of 360 activation of space, and you can't be relying on the way that a viewer is going to be experiencing that work. And I think that within art, we always kind of enjoy that element of chance, the fact that people are going to come in and do whatever the fuck they want and maybe not even look at the work. They're just in there to have a cheap drink and get some dinner. And that's part of the work. We sort of embrace these errors. And I think that that is sort of a beautiful space for virtual reality within an art context to exist, of sort of thinking about it as a flawed medium that happens in a form of sort of perpetual spatial time that we sort of move through spatially. Also, it has huge ramifications in regards to accessibility. So hopefully that's
Right.
an interesting direction as to where it could go.
Yeah, and that's some of the challenge, I think, with the contemporary art world adapting virtual reality as a medium. I think there's a widespread confusion between, for example, 360 video and
Yeah.
truly immersive virtual reality experiences.
That was 360. VR has to be interactive. But.
And so, oftentimes because the headset is such an isolating device as well, you're very individualized when you're in that viewing experience. I think there's a real problem with the art world, which is much more of a social space, and
Totally.
the understanding of the formal qualities of the medium are, they're underdeveloped because we can't kind of be in a space and point and talk about these kinds of things because you're inherently isolated. So, Kelly, from just the examples that you've shown, it's clear that you've experimented a lot with interactivity in that social space of the gallery. So maybe if you can talk a little bit about some of that experience and also maybe shed some more light on theories around represented bodies in virtual space.
Well, I think I've done my theories on represented bodies.
Yeah.
Call out if you want some more. But just to sort of open a conversation about some of the things you said first, about the kind of isolation of the kind of headset, and it occurred to me. It's not something I've been thinking previously, but it occurred to me as you were speaking about how perhaps there's a little bit more parallel between the kind of theatre or cinema experience than a kind of visual art context, which is often a lot more social. And I guess the thing that I haven't worked for VR since the mid-90s, when I was working in the kind of dance and technology scene that was kicking off at that time. So I haven't got anything directly to say about that, except that recently, you saw I threw up some images at the end of the PowerPoint there where I'm finding myself in a situation where I'm working in a heritage building, or I'm about to do a show in March next year in a heritage building that's being refurbished. And there's very limited access. Like there was lots of toxic poo, actually, possum poo and rat poo. So if we went in there, we could only go in there for 20 minutes. We had to wear a mask. And and the artists are making site-specific works. And because it's a heritage building, the refurbishment schedule has been, hugely delayed. And so it's this interesting situation where I'm curating the show of artworks that don't yet exist in a venue that doesn't yet exist. Fortunately, they created this 3D model of the space, and it was amazing because really having, it was like, oh my God, there's a window there, I totally forgot that, or, and having to, and being able to kind of use that to kind of envisage how those works might be situated in space, and then also having to use, like, even we can't get in there to see, because the show's a twilight show, so the idea is that it starts at twilight and gets darker and darker, and we're working with a lighting designer to kind of accommodate that particular kind of situation, and it's a truncated 3-night exhibition where everything is happening and it's a kind of performative encounter rather than being a set of fixed objects. So that's the inquiry, is about how we kind of curate, how we think curatorially about time when dealing with artworks that are transforming and moving and changing and fluctuating through the show. So even using things like, I found this groovy app online called Sun Calc, where you can like test the angle of the sun at very specific times of day and dates in the future or the past, to think about and to try and imagine how sunlight would be falling in the venue, which, assisted with, okay, so where's the best place to position the video pieces and that sort of thing, and using time zone calculators to kind of create temporal scores that are kind of structured around the kind of light fall in the venue, because aside from the heritage fabric, it's those, the natural score, which is the fall of light at twilight, is the other biggest parameter that we have to deal with.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned exhibition design in a virtualized way as well. It's something that I use a lot in my practice because oftentimes the artist won't be physically present as we're kind of planning the floor plan and the layout of the show. So it's a really effective way to think about scale and size of works, to think about, as you're saying, lighting and placement. And I think also another way that the virtualized space enters into my practice is that oftentimes the studio itself is virtualized. I mean, you probably work primarily in your computer, I imagine.
Several
and
computers.
yeah, exactly.
It's amazing.
Right? And I even have an artist who is an avatar, like they only exist in virtualized space. So I think that there are different kind of levels that that's being enacted within the studios. I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about this kind of collectivism and collaboration that I think is present in all of our works. So we see artists specifically who are working with technology, collectivizing in new ways to realize more ambitious projects and reach new audiences at larger scale. Xanthe, when we spoke, we discussed your work with Queer Tech IO. At the current, also what I'm doing, I'm looking at cooperative collection and new models for collaborative patronage. And Kelly, when we talked, I heard a little bit about your experience within the institution and adopting new ways of working and collaborating maybe across departments and thinking in different ways to support these kind of technology-based practices. So let's talk a little bit more about this. Xanthe, if you want to start maybe by telling us about the Queer Tech Collective.
Yeah, sure. Queer Tech IO is something that sort of happened. It sort of just made itself happen, which is such a beautiful thing when you're dealing with artists, because I mean, we're all highly ego-driven, emotional beings, and often collaborating can be kind of hard. But I think that the beauty of the collective that is Queer Tech and the way that it started is that we were artists that came together not because of any kind of social setting, but because we all were just really deeply into new media and the way that it was being practiced. So it was kicked off by Dr. Allison Bennett, who is an artist that's been working in Melbourne and internationally for a number of decades now, and she came to one of my shows a few years ago and sent me my first ever fangirl message on Facebook. And so I was like, well, I love you. I'll do anything with you. And we had sort of an online friendship for about a year. And then she sent me a message being like, I think I want to start this project called Queer Tech IO. Would you like to be a founding member of this collective with me? And then we brought on this guy, Dr. Travis Cox, who is a sort of an artist, but sort of more primarily kind of a very skilled coding practitioner. And then the three of us together sort of started this initially quite social project of looking at, we wanted to do sort of an international survey of the way that queer practitioners in particular are interacting with digital media. So we did just an open call out just to see what the hell would come back. And we wound up with this really interesting international collection of digital works that then sort of snowballed into an on and offline exhibition series and collaborations within us as a collective, and panels and partnerships with ACMI and RMIT and Testing Grounds and Midsummer Festival, and then we toured it across Australia and a couple of places internationally. Currently, we're working on a piece that we're launching this week, actually, as part of Melbourne Art Week. We're working with Experimenter Social, which is a really interesting organisation that runs out of ACMIX, actually. They run sort of a series of talks from digital practitioners. And we are working with them and Testing Grounds, and we've developed when I say we, definitely the other people in the collective that have the skills to do this. They have developed, I was in conversation when it was happening, a virtual version, a WebGL version of the Testing Grounds site. And I won't physically be there. They are going to be running an event, I believe it's on Wednesday night, where you can go down to Testing Grounds and they will live 3D scan you into the site. And you should be able to like find a version of yourself within the site, you know, half an hour later. It's like very much in testing phase. My contribution to this work was that I wanted to develop something that was specifically to be presented within this online space. So I've developed sort of this diptych work. I was thinking a lot about, you know, notions of like the shadow self and the online self, and the way that queer people interact online through this obsession with astrology. So I've developed two-part work that is a homage to my birth chart. I am 3 air signs. It's a real win. Libra Sun, Gemini Moon, Aquarius Rising. So that work is in the space, and you will only be able to view it within that particular web environment. And Testing Grounds is also about to close because they're building a newfangled contemporary art museum there, which is a contentious issue, I can tell. But I love that we have happened to build this version of the site, and we can now theoretically potentially collaborate with the current people that run Testing Grounds and continue to run exhibitions within that site. Nice. And host residencies within that online site. Nice. So that could be really exciting.
So the collective has enabled sort of a life beyond a physical space.
Absolutely.
For this space. Really interesting.
Yeah, we are promising eternal life. That's the aim of Queer Tech.
Wow.
Yeah.
Forever in Testing Grounds.
Yeah. Forever testing.
Okay, well, there's a couple of different hats I can wear on the collaboration issue. By nature, I'm quite a collaborative animal. I actually trained as a theatre director, not as an art historian, and have always worked in an interdisciplinary collaborative context. And the thing that really excites me is being able to achieve things that are much larger than yourself and things that you couldn't even dream of on your own. So that's kind of where I'm coming at everything I do from that basis. And I've worked in lots of different ways with artist-run collectives, and certainly this project I'm doing at Abbotsford Convent is hugely collaborative, and I've been overwhelmed by the kind of all of the artists involved are working in collaborative and process-orientated ways, and that's been a really, really rich experience. And the Abbotsford Convent have been amazing at supporting the project and providing us with access and resources to explore the venue in a new way. From the institutional side, it's really interesting. Any of you who have ever worked or maybe even brushed up against an institution will know how departmentalized they tend to be. And the research network that I facilitated, where we had people from all those different departments, even just getting a collections curator together with an art handler is almost unheard of. So you might be surprised that in institutions that, I think the Tate, there are 4 venues across 3 cities and over 800 people working there. So just bringing people internally together to have a conversation was a real stretch and hugely valuable and fruitful and rare, at the same time as having a dialogue with international peers who are coming into that conversation. So those things are challenging. There's a lot of time pressure on you when you're working in an institution. It's like output, 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 really, really public facing all the time. Everything you're doing is very public facing and judged on a constant basis by the public, the media, and all of your peers who are ready to eat you alive if you get something wrong. Maybe that's a British thing.
No.
Where are the ACMI people? I don't know what it's like for you. It's difficult and challenging to create the time for collaboration. I don't think it's not necessarily that people don't want to do it or aren't interested in doing it or that they don't see the value in it. It's just that time factor.
Right.
Yeah.
And it takes a different skill set in a way, because you have to give over control to gain the result of the collective talent. You have to learn to work with people in a different way. And...
Well, there's always a few dogs who will piss in a corner and stay there, but that's, at large, people are really friendly,
Just being conscious of time, I think we only have time for one more question. So we talked a lot about obsolescence and preservation yesterday. So I think I want to talk instead about the scarcity model of the art world, if y'all are interested in digging into this for a few minutes before we open it up to questions from the audience. And this was kind of a back channel that was going after my presentation and a couple others yesterday, saying if we're in this position to be rethinking these things around distribution and access of artworks, why are we still talking so much about additioning and kind of working within this system? So I want to frame this question maybe thinking more about the white cube, and that could be either an institutional gallery space or the gallery itself within a commercial context. Curious, what are attributes of that space that you find are still relevant and meaningful in our practice, and what might we want to think about and hold on to? And maybe an extension of that is like, how can we create change from within that system? So circling back to the beginning of the discussion, if we separate out the digital as something entirely separate, it isn't ever considered as part of the full canon. And that's, I think, really where we're all working and where we're thinking, is that it just is contemporary art. So how can we kind of work within the system to make that change, and what is still relevant there? What do we find useful?
Well, I think that the gallery, or the white cube, the physical space of the gallery is important for the same reason that it is problematic in the ways that we've talked about earlier, in that it is a crucial social space for people to be able to physically come together and share ideas. I mean, while we collectivize a lot of the time, I think that art and visual arts practice can be an incredibly isolating way to work, because you're constantly just, wanking about your own ego and trying to put that onto a canvas or whatever the hell you happen to work with. And I think that coming into those gallery spaces that exist in the world is a very important time for us to be able to see each other as other human beings and interact with each other. But I do sort of wonder if that is a space that needs to exclusively physically exist. I think that there is opportunity now to make those into virtual spaces that could theoretically be equally successful, though artists do love drinking.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank God for the wine.
We could drink alone and
there's certainly value in it. I never made work in proscenium arch theatres. As I said, I came from a kind of theatre background. I worked with dance and technology before, but even when I was making work, just out of university and still very kind of viewing the world through that framework, I was always creating collaborative projects in galleries or site-specific locations, because they're fundamentally more social in structure than a theatre or a cinema or those sorts of things. Yeah, I think we have to be a bit careful about being a little bit utopian about the internet and other places.
Yeah.
I mean, there's the work by Heath Bunting that I was showing you. The internet is it's over. It's with all of the kind of AI and surveillance technologies and corporate interests. I mean, that space is so coded, and where your work is situated and positioned in that context is just as sort of problematic and coded than in a gallery space. It's just a different set of codes that that you're kind of thinking about. So even the lounge room, like your own, whether what your socioeconomic situation is, or what area or what country, what the political environment is, what your religious background, all those things are also heavily code and kind of limit or define what is a safe thing for you to be doing in your own home. And so I think that every space is problematic on one level, but every space has the potential for a truly transformational moment to occur, given the right kind of attention and energy. So I guess that's what I wouldn't single out the white cube as being more problematic than any other space. I might put my
the
work
white
in.
cube, I mean, is problematic really because of its association so much with the institution. I suppose that's what we're really talking about.
Yeah, and the market at large too. Like, so as an
Absolutely,
artist who makes things in this way, which are meant to be distributed, they're meant to be publicly accessible. How do you think about sustaining a practice within that context?
But it is all just licensing and contracts. Look at Tino Segal, who doesn't make a single like a performance artist, if you're not familiar with his work, who doesn't make a single thing that's material. His background is interestingly in dance and economics. He studied both. And essentially when you purchase a Tino Segal work, you're purchasing a verbal contract.
Right.
So he came from a heavily industrialized area in Germany and made a commitment early in his life not to use any materials, not to actually impact the earth in a kind of material sense. So he's very dedicated to the notion of immateriality. So the contract isn't even on paper, and it's basically premised, as far as I can tell, although I'm not a financier, on the kind of derivative contracts that cause the subprime housing crisis in America. It's sort of trading on the value of art in general as a kind of derivative contract, and you know, and also only oral, so you can't document the work, you can't do any of that. So if you acquire the work, I think you have to allocate like 2 or 3 people to go to a lawyer's office. There's a verbal contract and a handshake, and then those people can only transfer that knowledge orally onto when they leave the institution onto another person. So I mean, there's the film industry, there's lots of actual models around how you can share ownership. And, certainly you're working in really interesting ways. And, I mean, I always feel like, artists will lead the way.
Yeah.
It's certainly not for the museum to tell them, how to do it better.
Right.
It's artists who are pushing these boundaries. Artists will find new ways to sort of, define the work. Pragmatically, in the network, Hannah Redler, who's the director of art at the Science Museum in London, when she was acquiring works into their collection, because they normally acquire, objects of science or, some kind of history of science, but they had this sort of anomaly gallery thing that was kind of stuck on the side that was about, sort of art and science, let's say. And what she found problematic in terms of valuing was comparative values. It's like if it's a unique, one-off or extraordinary or highly new thing in the context of the art world, and you can't compare it to another work of a similar nature, then it's just difficult to value.
Yep.
It doesn't mean it doesn't have a value. Right. So what Hannah ended up doing was creating comparable values out of other kind of technologized objects, if you like, and creating an argument around the value of the work that way. So I think the way we value things is I mean, the editioning it's just one aspect.
Right.
Because I think actually we value art not just on the basis of, the material, but also we value it kind of psychologically. And so you can still make those arguments, I think. It's just you have to kind of think a little outside the box.
Yeah. I love that you brought up these 2 examples because, and I think it is very true of artists who are pushing the envelope in this way. It requires a lot of work and a lot of structure around it. And then it's about finding an agent who is interested in aligning with those things, because a gallery costs money to sustain, and people oftentimes want physical objects in their home, and that's how that economy functions. So to have these kinds of new ideals enter the space, it takes someone who's willing to, I think, put that work and, put that forward into the world.
Yay, current.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Take us there.
So I think we're pretty much at time for the conversation, but did we want to open this up to questions? 15? Okay. Okay, great. Does anyone have a question or something they'd like to add to the conversation?
If there are any questions, please use the mic.
Stunned silence. Oh, there's
All
one.
right.
Yes.
Get that ball rolling.
Kelani, congratulations on the work you're doing at Current. I think that it's really interesting, the idea of getting the sort of patron supporters together to support art. So in terms of this conversation about actually maintaining an income for artists, I mean, you describe Current as a museum. Is it a gallery? Does any of the work come back to the artist in that scenario?
So we purchase works from artists, so they're getting paid for artworks that are under-collected, and that's kind of the goal of the museum.
Yep.
But we have some ideas in the future for how a museum might provide new forms of access, monetize that access, and then pay a living wage back to an artist. That's a very idealized future vision. We'll see how we get there, but I think there's a lot of opportunity to take a museum collection and insert it into different contexts, right? Like, it doesn't have to be in the hallowed halls of an institution necessarily. It could pop up within different kinds of institutions. It could pop up within different kinds of commercial contexts. We're talking about purely mediated objects, so maybe there's a screening fee for a conference or something that would like to include some cultural content alongside their programming. And the hypothesis is that, you know, the context of the museum can travel with it. We don't need that brick and mortar to emphasize that cultural importance. So that's one of the things we're thinking about in the future. But as of now, we're just buying weird art and paying artists, which feels really good.
Yeah.
I've been selling art for a long time, so to buy it is much more fun.
So in that scenario, do you have some kind of license agreement as well with the artist?
Yeah, well, we're working to develop new contracts and new forms of documentation and ways of communicating our intent, both to the artists who are generally pretty open to this kind of new thinking, but also to the agents who we're working with who edition and sell the works, the galleries that we're buying from.
Yeah.
Sometimes we buy directly from an artist studio, which I think is also an exception for an institution. They would typically only work with an agent when they're acquiring works. So that's something a little bit different. We're taking a little more risk. We're talking directly to a studio, and that also oftentimes requires more work because artists who are working without an agent maybe don't have good contracts in place around their work. They maybe don't understand about packaging or how to provide their work. So that's a little more overhead that we're taking on as an institution, but we're still, again, trying to operate within a system. We're not just opening this up completely. The other thing that we could do to be more open with our works is to commission our works. But again, there's so much great work that is already existing in the studios that needs to be collected. So that's really our focus right now, initially.
And how are you assessing that on views, or how do you?
Great question. What, assessing the?
The art and the importance of it.
The selecting the art, you mean?
Yeah.
Oh, selecting the art. So we have a process in place. We don't have one curator on staff. Our entire operation is a bit decentralized in that we're working with different resources, and what we're hoping to do in 2019 is start to seed new salon series in different locations in the world. And that's not about importing a New York perspective. It's about going into a new location, working with a curator in that region. But the way that it works is anyone who is a part of our committee, our membership globally, can recommend works that they're interested in becoming part of a collection. On the topics. So each salon has a topic like identity. Our next salon is truth. It's coming up this fall. So the curator, though, is the one who decides which works should be presented for and considered for acquisition. And that's as much an act of putting together a thoughtful selection of works around the topic as it is putting forth the right artists who have had the right kind of either exhibition history or kind of support for their work to make sure that we have a robust collection that represents not only emerging artists but also mid-career and what we're calling pioneers, so people have been working for 20 plus years within media art. We just collected a work from a pioneer, Stina Vasulka. We collected one of her early video works, Warp, from 2000, so that was really exciting because most of the work we have right now is more on the emerging side. So.
Yeah. And sorry, one more question.
Yeah.
I love the idea that the patrons then get to exhibit the works at their own houses. And how is that facilitated?
Yeah, so that's another piece of documentation that we're developing. So this isn't as if we're, it's not as if we're distributing hundreds of versions of these files. So the way that it's structured now is that our purchase agreement states that we intend to create a private exhibition copy, which we're then going to distribute to only the members who were present and voting in the salon, so the direct supporters of the work. This is a human network of trust. This isn't a technology solution. It's going to be different each time. So as part of our acquisitions process, We're working with a conservation studio called Small Data Industries, and they do a full artist interview, and it's really about the artist intent. We ask the question, what would it mean for this work to be accessed in a home? How would you like to see someone living with it? And for something like a virtual reality work, probably not everyone has a VR headset in their home. So we're not going to be delivering that work. We're going to be delivering some kind of acceptable iteration that the artist determines. So all I can tell you is what we've done thus far. So the first round, we gave a USB stick to our members. We encourage them to take it home and plug it into their TV and push play as they're hosting. So one of the things that's on that USB stick, for example, it's a piece of software, and the artist did a sort of performative run-through of the software that fits on a single channel screen. So we're thinking about ways that it can be dwelled with, and then as we distribute these USBs, we're having our members sign a contract that states that they understand that they don't own the work, the museum owns the work, they can't distribute the work, it's meant for private exhibition and this kind of intimate access. But we're hoping that what happens is that people invite other people into their home, and that becomes a touch point for the collection, and also sparks a dialogue about what it means to live with these works in a new way. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. I do have a question, but if you allow me to get to the question through a bit of background. My friend invited me here. I'm a dancer primarily, but I've gone through a massive breakdown and healing, which also happened in the online space because some of the online space is a place where you can express and transform yourself. So it's incredibly powerful, and I think it's incredibly powerful what all of you are doing here in Melbourne, particularly because it's sad to hear about testing grounds. I didn't know I've performed there. And, I think spaces like this are basically some of the few safe spaces for artists to be and perform, and it's getting more and more difficult. And they're being pushed. In some ways, I'm actually a dancer. I deal with the body, but I've by default become like a cyber artist because I don't fit the usual model. Anyway, with all that, and I'd love to speak to each of you a bit more. The challenge with, okay, it's great, we have this space for expressing ourselves. I feel like the biggest challenge is always still communication, because we are physical and social beings. So queer tech sounds fantastic, but I want to hear, what are these other spaces or maybe potential spaces where these queer anarchistic artists who are not fitting into to what's on offer basically in Melbourne can come together, have more dialogue like this, create more changes. Thank you.
Okay, everybody's looking at me.
This is a question about Melbourne. So.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm also from Melbourne. Yeah. No, you're totally right, and it's odd that there aren't more collectives of the same sort of accord as queer tech out there. Like, online exhibition is very much a thing that is happening at the moment, and I mean, Kelani is very much, leading us into battle with that one. I can't really speak to alternative spaces that might exist, but I would encourage you to attempt to start one of those collaborations yourself. I mean, the beauty of the online space is that it has this mass democratizing effect. So everybody has the same, ideally, I mean, I'm obviously speaking from a very privileged Western perspective here. Everybody has the capacity and the access to the same sorts of technologies, and coding is getting to be less and less a part of what you actually need to be able to do to work in these online spaces. There's drag and drop technologies. There's programs like Unity that are pretty user-friendly that you can then load into virtual environments. I mean, I've seen galleries hosted within spaces like Minecraft before. Like, there's so many different points of access, and the internet is so much bigger than the actual world is. Second Life is another great space where I mean, it's a bit obsolete these days, but that was, the sort of utopian vision of those spaces before it inevitably descends into just porn, essentially. There are these new, unique, semi-physicalized online spaces where you know, if you don't feel like there is a appropriate cyborgian dance gallery out there, find 3 other people and make one.
No, thank you. I guess I'm also looking from the opposite perspective of, even though I, like most people, have become or used these forms of expression, on a deeper level, I'm a very physical being and I'm a very social being. So actually how to bring these cyberqueer outcasts together in a more physical and more social, direct ways to have the conversations to make the change. Because
Isn't it called Facebook? Or, you know, it's relationships, I think, isn't
Yeah.
it? It's
Yeah.
just, you know, a matter of building relationships with what,
Sure.
however you can,
Sure.
rather than thinking
Yeah.
about it as a physical space.
Yeah, I mean, an interesting example of this in particular kind of falls into my weird insights into the Australian YouTube community that happened when I was doing that 1 million views series a few years ago. I think that what struck me as super interesting about this very specific niche area of people that were pumping out, some of them, you know, several YouTube videos a day, is that they felt like they were finally able to find a true sense of community online. And so their practices were not so much about the quality of their work, but the engagement that they had with other creators and with the fans that they had acquired through their channels, which then led to these much broader social aspects. So they would have online meetups through spaces like Google Hangout, and then that again led to kind of more physical ramifications of those things. So one of the people that we were following around was this really weird, great dude called Angry Aussie, who just had these untapped 25-minute long political ranting videos. They are just so dull, and you're like, how did this happen? And he actually had become sort of like the figurehead of the Melbourne YouTube community, and he would run all of these IRL meetups. So they would often, like, you know, they would have their little YouTube parties and then they would come together. I went to one of them here at Fed Square, actually, and just looking at the way that these online personas then traveled into the world, but they all had this common interest, so they could all be weird together. They were like the continuation of what would happen to theatre kids if they just cut themselves off from reality completely after graduation. It's amazing. Like the beauty of the internet is that there are so many different places to find your niche, and if you have common interests, then there is potential for real world follow through beyond that point. So,
Totally. Thank you. And how to that? I mean, I'm just following on, but to make. To come together and make the changes and you know, I mean, I feel like this is going a bit off topic, but there should be some mass collective protest against the closing of Testing Ground. I'm quite shocked that I'm really shocked. I went to the Australian Ballet School, so for me, part of the joy of performing radically at Testing Ground is I wasn't given that space of creativity at the place where, you know, I paid thousands of dollars to be trained like a penguin. Yeah. So, and you know, they're going to continue to get funding and funding and funding. And anyway, that's a little bit, it's just an example, not just testing grounds.
Is closing as that physical space, but I have faith that because of the impact that they have had on, as an experimental actual testing space for artists, like it actually does its job of what it says, which is what makes it so special. I feel that they won't have too much trouble simply moving that site to be somewhere else. It just won't be there.
Oh, that's good. Thank you.
Yeah.
So truly physically the Salon idea might work.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have a question or something?
Yep.
I just had a question about the conversation around editions and the valuing of different works, and whether emerging technologies in blockchain have some role to play, or whether there's developments there that are actually useful in terms of adding into that valuing of works, or kind of giving them a limited distribution and therefore higher value.
There was actually a conversation about exactly that at the NGV just a couple of months ago that I wanted to go to but couldn't go on that night. I think the thing about blockchain is, I mean, it'll be interesting to see how it develops as a technology, or how it's applied as a technology. At the moment, without knowing, too much about what the conversation was at the NGV, what the technology is capable of, even, other than at a very surface level, my knowledge, is I feel a bit like the reason that blockchain will work is because it kind of brings the kind of ideal of peer-to-peer, the strength of peer-to-peer as a concept, into contact with actually a mainstream commercial set of interests. So to me, it feels like it could be a little bit of a double-edged sword. Like to me, there's a little bit of a whiff that it could just be another DRM kind of technology coming our way that will ultimately limit access, which is where it becomes valuable in a kind of commercial art context. So I think that we have to be really, I want to be more on, that's why I really wanted to go to that conversation, and I feel like, it's good to be alert of how that technology is developing and how it's being spoken about in commercial art sort of circles. I don't know if you've had any conversations with any of your colleagues, Kelani, around how they see it might be usefully applied.
Yeah, I talk about blockchain a lot, actually. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on blockchain.
I don't know what blockchain is.
No? Okay.
But I am going to look into it. Sounds relevant.
Google it. Google it.
Yeah.
So I was actually the Art Basel conversation panel that I was on in the fair recently was on blockchain in the art world. So it's an area of deep interest for me. I also work professionally on the technology side with a client called Protocol Labs, who run a number of decentralized web initiatives. One of them is called IPFS, the Interplanetary File System, which is a very cool way for what you're talking about, for us to take ownership of our data and deal in new peer-to-peer decentralized networks in new kind of ways. The promise of the early web, which was never really manifest and ended up in all these sort of centralized powers, is now a new potential for us with these forms of decentralized technologies.
Doesn't it just feel like it could be just another utopia?
No, it is, and
spoiled?
actually, what's happening in a lot of this conversation is that it is exactly this analogy you're making with rights management, and a lot of these conversations. So a perfect application of blockchain technology is asset control, and more art is being treated as an asset for this sort of collector in name only, this sort of investor type collector. But technically, from a technical perspective, blockchain technology can give us an authentic digital art object. And that kind of authenticity is something that is a missing piece in a way. We're dealing right now with paper certificates and questions around distribution versus an authenticated copy, what's real, what's authentic. So it has the capability to help us solve that problem, but the real problem is more when we talk about additioning and access and a market around these new kinds of works, is more about values. And that's a human thing, that's a relationship thing. That's not something that technology is going to solve. We have to build new values around what it means to have these kinds of immaterial artworks, what it means to own something that is also publicly accessible online. Why would I buy that if everyone can have it? These are the kinds of sentiments that we need to adjust. And actually, I think the real potentials for blockchain are less around this kind of asset control applications and are more around these kinds of decentralized sharing and building in new rules of value into systems and using that technology to do that. So I think it's absolutely going to transform our entire world, but also
But it's got the same double edge. Like, if you're interested in knowing about it, I recommend going out and finding out about it. And, we should all sort of be on top of that.
Xanthe,
what
we need
happens
you.
in that
Yeah,
space.
I'm going to do that.
We need you to Google it. No, we really need artists to be engaged with this technology.
Are you doing it now?
Yeah.
Well, I think that's such a problem. Like, artists don't know how to value their own works, though. Like, I think that especially working within digital space with intangible objects, I mean, we kind of looked at you guys to be like, give me value. So I don't know about these things.
Right, but if you start to look into the mechanisms, you can tell me like, oh, but this would be interesting. Oh, but what if we did it like this? And as a technologist or as someone who's thinking about the market, I'm not going to come to that with the same kind of ideas about how to subvert it and twist it and actually like move it away from, you know, the white male mentality that built the thing, the Silicon Valley culture that drives it right now. We need other values shaping and
I will email you both once I have Googled.
Google it. Other questions? I think we're pretty much at time or over time, but maybe 5 more minutes? Okay, cool. Anyone else want to jump into the discussion? Yeah?
Yeah, I'm just finding it really hard to articulate what I'm even trying to ask because, that idea of value and attaching value and, exhibiting it or owning it, like the idea of ownership with digital art, I mean, that's something that it plays with. It takes, very pop culture things or a GIF that somebody made and we all watched, and then putting that into your own work. It's all very pastiche and postmodern and time-based and immaterial, and is even owning something like that, limiting it, because...
Great question.
Well, how do you put value on something that is firstly continually transforming, like that it is required to continually be consumed by masses and therefore transformed through that consumption, because it's not something, I mean, as you said, it's something that might be 360 and you can't control how someone's looking at it or something. Like bringing it into existence and being consumed is essentially how it is given life, right? But then like trying to own it or trying to put it into a gallery or I don't know, would that even stop that? Would that continue that? How is that value? Like, how would you think in the current way? How would you think in a way of attaching value or attaching money or attaching any kind of the old thinking to something like this?
But what if, could you think about it as not about ascribing value to the digital object necessarily, but valuing the time it took you or someone else to create it? And offering an exchange, some kind of mechanism of exchange that you would value. Typically that's money, but, there's been all other kinds of, value exchange mechanisms used for centuries in all different kinds of culture. So, if money isn't of value to you, there might be other things, and you can feel free to value your time, in a different way.
But even then, like, attaching time, okay, so if we put value, that's even problematic, putting it, okay, well, the time that they spent to do it. But I don't know, sometimes it's just chucking a bunch of stuff together or writing a line of code.
But that's all right. I mean, you don't need to put a technocratic linear structure on time either.
Right. But that's the thing as well. It's like you can't then attach value to time, because something might not take a long time to make, but it might... What the value, I guess, lies in the theory of it, which is something that's fleeting. It lies in what people are thinking about it, or the theory behind why it was created, or how it got there, or how it exists.
So that accumulates. So all of that doesn't just happen in an instant, right? So it's happening not in a linear sense, like it takes me like 5 minutes from 10 o'clock to 10:05 to make this piece of work, but that, there's an accumulation of moments that occur in a kind of relational field that accumulate to a kind of a shared object or a shared experience, or the performance of something that has an innate value based on the energy and human effort, right, let's say. And it could be, and often actually in this space, collective human effort, and
or like a resonant theory, or like a resonant...
I mean, I would just like, feel free to throw off the shackles of what we understand time and value to be in a kind of neoliberal technocratic world, and create your own structure that you feel comfortable with.
Yeah, but for me, then owning it or buying it and keeping it like as a gallery or selling it even becomes so problematic. Yeah,
that's
I mean,
okay.
No,
that
it's
must be
true.
so hard.
Well, we're
Like,
in,
how
and
do
I
you
think we're
do
in a
that?
shifting moment where we need to inject these new values. I'm so glad you brought up the question of labor as a way to value an artwork, because labor is so obscured, specifically when it comes to digital art. Like oftentimes people have the idea like, oh, you're just using a software to do this, but when you actually see the time and the obsessive way that digital art comes together, from a composition perspective, from an iteration perspective, from a sourcing perspective, from what you're saying, like just getting to the place where you're ready to actually execute the concept.
learning the
It's so
software.
intense. It's so labor intensive, and we tend to devalue that in an immaterial or an ephemeral, like an animated GIF. Oh, that's just a GIF. Like, what did you make it on Blingy? It took like 5 minutes, right? No,
I love Blingy.
these take a long
Yeah, but that's the thing. Like, those things
make.
are very important for this kind of art. You know, it's like, because it's a reflection on culture, and it's all ideas and theoretical and immaterial, and it's not something you can put your hand on or your finger on, because it's going to change in 5 minutes. Or does it then become irrelevant very quickly, or does it become more important? Like,
I have this idealized version of the future of the art market, specifically the secondary art market, where an auction price is determined by the number of views, the number of times someone's downloaded or copied or distributed a work, as opposed to its scarcity, which is what it's determined on now.
That's how they're doing music these days, right?
yeah, but that's the only thing I can relate it to. It's like, as you said, going to the theater or purchasing a digital copy of it, like a music track or something.
So
like,
it's an event, not an object.
it's an event. It's not an object.
I guess, yeah. So that's another kind of framework you can.
Then
look
how do you
through.
own an event in a gallery?
I've got one other kind of quite like different point to make, though, that might be helpful or might not. You know, as I kind of went through in my presentation, that, you know, this desire to actually operate outside all of those structures is a really common and long-running theme of avant-garde practice, of those who are, you know, operating at the kind of cutting edge, or whatever, you know, word you'd like to use. I won't use zeitgeist because I know you don't like it. We've already had that conversation. And that's fine, and that's good, and not everything has to be collected, and not everything has to be in a museum, and it doesn't mean that it has any less value. So that's one thing. The other thing that I've noticed, working in the museum context and being a specialist in these kinds of fields, like not just new media, but like, you know, observing, it's really only been in the last decade that all the conceptual art and performance art and early video art, that's only just been coming into collections. It like, in the time that I worked at the Tate, like there was, you know, they had none of that when I got there, and there's, you know, quite a lot of it now, and I'm sure it's the same for the NGV and Australian collection agencies and in the US. A lot of those artists were, particularly the conceptual artists, you know, were really adamantly denying the whole kind of system of commercial art market, and that was like a really core aspect of their manifesto. And that's, or if you're performing or doing event-based stuff, takes a lot of energy. It's great when you're young, but then people like Marina Abramovic deserve a pension, because, you know, people, or Dan Graham or Joan Jonas, these people transformed what we understand contemporary art to be, and made a huge and valuable contribution that other people have drawn on and other people have gotten fat on. And, you know, at a certain point, at a certain age, artists aren't able physically, you know, it's taxing to travel around the world doing happenings. And then, you know, so, you know, having these other kind of things that can circulate on your behalf, that are ascribed the value of all those years of practice outside is also okay, and that maybe, you know, there's a point at which it becomes sensible for what you're doing to be situated in that context, or maybe it doesn't, but it doesn't matter right now. If your manifesto is really about circulating in another space, that's a positive, and that has huge amounts of value for society at large, I would say. But that, you know, just a lot of artists who start out that way you know, as they get into their, or, you know, even worse, the artist actually passes away, sadly, at a very young age, and their estate takes over and milks it like a cow. That also happens. So, you know, and I think it's, given how much documentation happens of work, whenever I work with young artists, I always advocate that you think really clearly about how your work is documented, who has that documentation, who owns it, what you're doing with it, and make your own decisions about it, because if you don't take ownership of it, somebody else will, and they'll get fat off it.
Yeah, I think that idea of ownership and being artist-driven is just more, like, becoming more and more important. Like, that artist you was talking about, how he, you know, all verbal contracts, and, like, that's a decision that the artist is going to have to make now about consumption, because it's not like you can control it once it's out. Like,
But you're in control. The artist is in control. I think that's my main message. You decide, you tell us.
Yeah, very cool.
Thanks. Cool. Cool. Thank you. Cool. Thank you so much.